We have not had sound. Okay, well, we've got sound now.
Oh, oh my goodness.
That's all right. We'll so for the things that we've already talked about that did not good with lip reading. Thank you, Dave. Appreciate you finally telling us. For the things that we've already covered, we will make sure we add that to the wrap up. To the
Okay. Well,
yeah.
let me run then. Since we missed out, we're going to run through. We talked to, for those of you who are just now tuning in and who stayed around while we were in the veil of silence.
Yes.
I will run through this really quickly then. Grognards Doing Good. Founders and Legends raised over $9,000 through Extra Life for the Children's Miracle Network. We also mentioned the Pickled Dragon Fund, where Mount Rauscher is an RPG creator who was paralyzed from the waist down. You can, in our show notes, find that out with the Pickled Dragon, and you can even get 3D miniatures printed for you. And that is a great thing to support. Matt needs that help to help him find more accessibility. We're now currently talking about Bundle of Holding, which raises money for a variety of charities. We talked about the Lone Wolf Adventure Game System, which was kind of a choose your own adventure system book. And so the Lone Wolf Adventure Game by Joe Dever supports Crumlin's Children's Hospital in Dublin, Ireland. And then we have Warlock, the tabletop fantasy role-playing from Fire Ruby Designs, inspired by the early days of British role-playing. That's supports pandemic-related charity Direct Relief. And last but not least, it doesn't seem very grognardy, but Fate Worlds and the Toolkit bundle brings you 5 dozen ebooks for the Fate tabletop role-playing rules from Evil Hat Productions, including Fate of Cthulhu. That supports pandemic-related charity Direct Relief. And if you have stories of Grognards doing good, please let us know, and we will be happy to post them on the show.
So the troll says that the spell duration on silence ran out, and then we followed up with a haste spell on Derek. That was an amazing quick recap. Thank you, sir, for doing that. Please do go check out our show notes. After this, they'll be up on our website tomorrow morning, and check out all of these great efforts that are putting out lots of good charity work for the community, for the gaming community. So, real quickly, since we were just talking about Call of Cthulhu, we just want to very briefly touch on something that happened this week. Sandy Peterson, longtime Call of Cthulhu designer, put out a few things that were questioned by a lot of folks in the community that looked pretty negative on the trans community. And we here at the Good Grognards would just like to take a moment to say that while this is a complicated subject about the role of trans athletes, we are by no means experts on that. We are supportive of our trans community friends, and we stand with them. So we just want to take a moment to say that. Moving on. So, why are we here, Derek? Since we were silent at the top of the stream, why are we here? What are we talking about today?
Well, today, as you silently mentioned earlier, is Gary Gygax Day. Today is the 83rd anniversary of Gary Gygax's birth, the co-creator of Dungeons and Dragons. And we thought, since we're grognards and Gary Gygax influenced much of our early role-playing and had a huge impact on us, I mean, just the name Gygax was something unusual for us as children. It was not a common name we saw. So whenever we saw Gary's name on a book, we said, oh, that's Dungeons and Dragons. So it would be more, it is necessary that we acknowledge today as Gary Gygax Day, and that we mention him and we talk about his impact on this hobby. as I was listening to Founders and Legends this weekend, one of the things Luke said I thought was very important. He said, even if his dad and Dave Arneson had not created Dungeons and Dragons, someone else would have probably invented a role-playing game, though it would have been different. There were people out there before them that were already working on similar things. And even Ed Greenwood was already writing some of his Forgotten Realms stuff that eventually became a game setting. And so there was already things out there, but it would have been different. It wouldn't have been the same. It would have been a different branch in the multiverse. And we were influenced by that. And I think it's more than appropriate to mention Gary's influence on the hobby that I believe still lasts to this day. And I think there are a lot of things that people can learn about role playing from that. We could pick up some new habits and refresh some old habits from that time. Personally, Gary meant a lot to me as an individual because I had the opportunity to begin talking with Gary online via a few Christian message boards in the early 2000s. I first encountered Gary through the Fans for Christ message board, where a bunch of Christian gamers got together to talk about their love of tabletop games and their love of their faith. And that's where I met Gary, whose online handle was Colonel Plato. And Gary and I began to talk and chat. We sent a few direct messages to each other. We also had sent a few emails to each other. And he was just very generous with his time, very generous with his conversation, and more than willing to talk about his faith as well as his love of role-playing games. I didn't get to meet him in person, face to face, until 2007, when I was invited to come to Gen Con and take part on a panel in Faith in Gaming, where Gary was going to be one of our main speakers. Before that panel, I was very fortunate to meet Gary before the panel. We got to sit down, have a snack together, drink some tea together. And we didn't even talk about our love of gaming at that point. We talked about our love of good food. And we found out we both love fried green tomatoes. And so it was a great time. I think one of my funniest memories is Gary and I were a few minutes late to the panel, because what happens when you get a preacher and a game designer to talk about a wide variety of things, you talk too long. And so we showed up about 2 or 3 minutes late to the panel, and I was just flabbergasted because they had started without us. And it was just a blast to be able to film that, a wonderful time of conversation. And again, I just found Gary to be such a generous person with his time, such a great conversationalist. And one of my most important memories of Gary was that, he was still growing even as he got older, and not just growing in concepts of game design and things like that, but he was still growing as a person. And I thought that was very powerful, that a man at that age in his life would still talk about growing as an individual, how his views on certain things had changed and grown. And I thought that was quite amazing. And that's made an impact on me as a person, to realize, no matter how old I get, I still need to be expanding and growing in my views on topics.
Yeah.
So those are some of my experiences with Gary. I was very sad that when he passed away, because he had invited me to come up to Lake Geneva for a gaming convention and play some games with him. And I was not able to do that because my anniversary was close to the time of that convention. And so I wanted to spend some time with my wife, and I was not able to get away. And sadly, he died a few months later. And I don't think without Gary Gygax and my interactions with him, there would be a geek preacher to this day. I don't know if I would ever chosen that path to be a geek and a preacher to those within our gaming community. But Gary's example and his kindness towards me showed me that geeks need preachers too. So that's my story of me and Gary.
I love that. I love that. I had not heard the beginning of that story before. I didn't realize that you guys had actually met on a message board. That's awesome. What was his name? What was his handle? Colonel Plato? Like
Colonel Plato. Colonel Plato.
Like the philosopher? Like Plato?
No, it was Plato, Pladoh, like Plato.
Like Play-Doh. Huh.
He had a sense of humor.
He did. Oh, he did have a sense of humor.
He loved puns.
Yes.
Oh, my Lord. Yeah. He would post puns on the message board. He would send you puns privately, and some of them were horrible. And so, yeah. Well,
in prepping for this today, because I never had the chance to meet Gary. I was at Gen Con 2000 when they brought him up on stage and they gave the standing ovation for him, in conjunction with the anniversary and of course the release of 3rd edition and everything, and that was awesome. So I did get to see him in person, but I never got to interact with him in person. So in preparation for this today, I actually went back and read some old interviews with him and watched what video interviews there were of him. Of course, if you search Gary Gygax interview, you get the 60 minutes interview 9 times out of 10, which is not really the interview you want to watch to get a sense of who Gary was. But it's still, if you've never watched it, it's an interesting thing to watch just for the moment in time that it was. But I got that sense of humor through reading these interviews with him. He had a way with words. That was the one thing that really stood out to me, because you could tell these were interviews from like the early 2000s, I think. So it was when he was working on Legendary Adventures or Legendary Games, and you could tell that they had sent him the questions and then he was responding back with in text form. And there's just he just had a certain way with words that everything, you could just hear sort of this humor in the way that he wrote. And I just really liked that. The Troll says, got randomly assigned to 2 games with Gary at an early 90s Gen Con. Gene Robb was running the tables. I didn't know who he was until between games, but I would describe him as joyfully irreverent. That's what I'm talking about. That came through just in this these short snippets that he typed for these answers to these interviews. I can only imagine that even in real life it was just amped up.
The fact that the Troll got to play with Gene Robb and Gary Gygax.
Right.
I mean, Gene is just a wonderful writer. She friended me on Facebook a number of years ago, and we've had some wonderful conversations. She asked me about some things for one of her books, which I was just honored she would do that. I don't even know if she gave me credit. I don't care. The fact that Gene Robb asked me for something about her book. But she is just a wonderful human being, and wrote, honestly, I'll probably get some people mad at me, but for those of you who don't know, Andre Norton wrote what I think is the first book on gamers going into a fantasy world, and it was called Quag Keep, and I believe it was written in 1976.
Okay.
And Quag Keep was okay. But Return to Quag Keep, which was written by Andre Norton and Gene Robb, was just really, really good. I would honestly call them 2 separate books.
Yeah.
And so if you ever want to read something by Gene Robb, or read something that really has a profound impact on the beginnings of our hobby, read Quag Keep and Return to Quag Keep.
Awesome.
Really good books, but a little bit envious of you there, DeTroll.
He says he also had Bruce in there as well.
Wow, was that Bruce Hurd Troll? Did you have Bruce Hurd in there?
That's who I would assume he means.
That's who I'm assuming you mean.
Yeah.
I've met Bruce a few times.
Oh, Bruce Robb.
Robb.
Bruce Robb.
Bruce
Okay.
Robb. Okay.
Gotcha.
Yeah. I don't know Bruce. I don't know Bruce Robb. I've met Bruce Hurd a few times.
Yeah.
And he's a really nice person. Really nice person.
Well, good deal. Well, anybody else that's hanging around chatting, if you've got other memories or questions about, what was Gary Gygax like, drop those in there. We'd love to continue talking about him. While that's going on, though, let's pivot over for a moment and do our segue segment of what's new on your shelf. So,
Woo-hoo-hoo.
Derek,
so
what is new on your shelf this week?
Well, my in-laws came over this weekend to spend some time with us before school starts back up for our son. And they brought me a little bit of a late birthday present. And my brother-in-law got me Frank Herbert's Dune, the graphic novel.
Uh-huh.
And I read the original Dune through 5 or 6 times when I was from the ages of 13 to 15, if not more. I loved the original Dune book, especially the original trilogy. And I had been wanting to get a copy of this book. I'd heard really good things about it. And so now, it is Dune, the graphic novel, and of course the artwork in here is it's updated, it's modern artwork. So it looks good. I haven't started reading it yet, but it is here, and that is on my list to be read, which continues to grow daily.
Who's the artist on that?
Oh yeah.
Give some credit where credit's due there.
Yeah, it was adapted by Brian Herbert and Kevin J. Anderson for the story.
Nice.
And it was illustrated by Raul Allen and Patricia Martin.
Okay.
So they had a really good team, and it is published by Abrams Comic Arts.
Okay.
I'm not familiar with that. Yeah, but it's a very well made book, and I believe, it's got. No, it doesn't have the tight binding. Sadly, it does not have the the really tight binding. It's just the glued in binding, which makes me sad for hardback. But, well, what can you do? It was a birthday present, so there we go.
Yep. And also, speaking of Dune, since we're talking about it, have you seen the new Dune trailer? What did you think about it?
I have. It looks really good. I've heard they're going to break it up into 2 movies. My biggest problem, I think, with the length of these movies is if I did go see one in the movie theater, I wish they would bring intermissions back, because I'm an old man now, and I have a bladder the size of a pea.
Yep.
And I say size of a pea because I have to go pee a lot. And so if they release that only in the movie theaters, it might be a little time before I get it, because I think it's got a 2.5-hour runtime.
I would imagine.
Like that.
Yeah.
And I barely made it through the Lord of the Rings when they first came out.
Yeah.
In fact, I know I didn't make it all the way through it. I had to run to the bathroom during the Lord of the Rings.
Yeah.
So, I'm looking forward to it. The trailer looks good.
Yep.
Technology keeps getting better and better.
Yeah.
And it sounds to me like they're going to really keep the story going.
Yeah.
And that's what makes me happy.
It looks like a really good cast, too. Denis Villeneuve, the director, I really enjoy his work. But the cast looks really good. I like the idea of Oscar Isaacs playing Atreides. I think that's awesome. That's a good fit there. But the whole cast looks really good. So I'm looking forward to it. It looks good.
Well, the Dune movie holds a special place in my heart, because Dune was the first movie I ever remember seeing based off of a novel I read.
Yeah.
And I will tell you, even though that movie was nothing like the book, I still enjoyed it. I think I was 13 or 14 years old. I still enjoyed that movie because it was the first movie I ever remember saying, I read this book, I love this book, and I want to see the movie.
Yep.
And my dad, that was not a movie he would have seen. He just, he dropped me off at the movie theater. I remember waiting in line. There was a really long line to get in. I got into the movie, and my dad just stayed out there and took a nap in his vehicle the entire time I was in the movie theater, because my dad was cheap, and he said, I'm not going to waste gas coming back out here to pick you up. I will just take a nap. And that's the way my dad was. So I went in to see Dune by myself, you know, and at 13 or 14 years old, getting to see a movie by yourself is a pretty big thing.
Yeah.
And you know, and I think it was PG-13 or something like that. And so that would have made me feel like a big kid.
Yeah.
Dave Carroll said, dehydrate and fast before the long running movies.
Yep. Or just do like, what'd they do with, was it either Infinity War or Endgame? I guess it was Endgame, where they basically were like, this is a 3.5 hour movie. You need to go pee at this point. Like they gave a pee spoiler to say, like, when you see the Hulk eating a burrito, go pee.
They even have an app for that stuff now.
Yeah, I know, right? Because of that. It's crazy.
What's funny, it's purely an American thing.
It's
intermissions, not to put in. They cut them. They do special cuts for other countries so that they can have an intermission, because they are not masochists.
Right. The troll says, we rented the theater and they paused it for us. Man, that's living the good life right there.
I'm telling you. I'm telling you.
There was something else I was going to say. I don't know what it was. Oh, I know what it was. So I didn't get to go see it in the theater because when you were a teenager going to see it, I was not quite yet.
You would have been little bitty.
I was still a little bit younger. So I got a question for you. When you went, because I've heard stories about this, did you get the laminated card that told you who everybody was?
No.
See, I've always heard it. I know you didn't need it. I know you didn't need it, but I've heard stories that they handed those out, and I'm like,
if they did, by the time I got in the theater, I mean, it was weird for me because I had never seen a line that long for a movie. And I'm serious. I still remember it was in a movie theater in Monroe, Louisiana, and the line stretched around the building, and when I got into the theater, it was packed.
Man.
And I ended up sitting next to this older kid who was either in high school or college. And it was an experience for me because he was cracking jokes through the whole movie, which I thought was funny. And he was there because he also had read Dune.
Okay.
So that made me feel cool for the first time in my life, that I was not this weird, nerdy kid, that there were other people in the world that actually liked the same things I did, and they were older than me.
That's cool.
So and so I just looked at him. I said, "Fear is the mind killer. Fear is a little death that brings total obliteration. I will let my fear wash over me and pass over me, and then I will look back upon it with my inner eye, and only I will remain. More deep, more deep, more deep." I'm sorry. I got to geek out on Dune. Man. I love Dune.
That's awesome. So for my what's new on the shelf, now because we didn't have audio at the beginning, we kind of had to blow through this a little bit. But if you go back and look at the still images for Grognards Doing Good, you will see. Actually, I'll put it back up here just so people know what we're talking about.
Yeah, put it up there.
Put it up there again. Oh, I think I closed it out. I closed it out. Let's see here if I can get it back.
Shame on you! Shame on you!
Well, I got to keep things running, nice and smooth over here, because heaven forbid I do something like forget to turn our mics on. Oh, that's tiny. And let's go right.
Blow it up.
There it is. There it is. And it's still tiny. I still don't know why it's doing that. Okay. There we go. Nope. Windows doesn't want to behave. Okay, forget it. So it'll be in the show notes. Matt Rauscher, the Pickled Dragon. we talked about his GoFundMe to help him get some accessibility in a new home. And one of the ways that you can help with that is by going to Adventures in 3D. It's an Etsy shop, and you can put in the code Get Pickled to get 20% off any order that you do from there. And it's a great cause, and all the benefits from all the proceeds from that go to the GoFundMe, which goes through the end of this month. So I spent probably more money than I should have, but it was for it was a good cause, and as a good friend, so I splurged a little, and I want to show this guy off because I finally got him. So this actually comes in 2 parts, but that is a pretty sweet Tarrasque miniature. Probably one of the better sculpted Tarrasques I've ever seen. It does come with a base for it that it eventually will glue on, and I'll paint. He's not quite to scale. The base is, so if you're running 5th edition D&D, this is a 4 square base, so this will cover the basic grid that you would need to say this is where a colossal monster would be. But if you put him up next to your actual miniatures, he's a little tiny. But that's okay. He looks awesome. I've was talking with some friends of mine about it, and one of them made the point that the Tarrasque is basically the kaiju of D&D, right? He's the Godzilla of it's the Godzilla of D&D. And so they were like, this is just Godzilla Jr. This is just Godzuki. This is
no. You're kidding, Godzuki. You're kidding, Godzuki.
Well, this miniature is not the Tarrasque itself, but my miniature is the Tarrasque Jr. But it's really cool. And I got a whole bunch of other stuff too that I don't have nearby to show you, but they have a really cool set of the Fellowship of the Ring. I grabbed those. Those look really nice. And again, I mentioned earlier during the Cone of Silence, but I also found they actually have a Tasselhoff Burfoot from Dragonlance. Hard to find those, especially these days, but a 3D printed one that is going to look really nice. I'm in the middle of painting him up right now. So that's what's new on my shelf. Please go support Matt. Go get some really cool miniatures. They also do, if you are 5th edition minded, they do some of the rarer player races, lineages that you don't find miniatures for a whole lot. So if you really are looking to do a Fearbold Paladin, you can find a miniature for that there, or a Warforged Druid. Yep, they got those too. So go check them out. Dave Carroll says, in the Throne of Bloodstone, the words "a Tarrasque" freaked us out. I think the words "a Tarrasque" freaks everybody out if they know what they're talking about. Man, that's a fun monster. I've never run it in a game, but Derek, I've got a miniature now.
Yeah, I'm a little nervous there, but at the same time, I'm not too nervous about it, simply because Tarrasque came out in 2nd edition, didn't they?
Yeah, I think so. We'll have to go back to the tapes and double check that. I don't think it was.
I do not remember Tarrasques in my 1E games, and so when I hear Tarrasque, I'm just like, okay, whatever.
Because it was after your time, right?
Well, I played 2nd edition for a while, but I was. Tarrasques never came up in the 2E games I played in, so I never really saw Tarrasques. I was used to demons and devils and archfiends and all of that sort of thing.
Right. Let's see.
So it wasn't until 3rd edition that I started seeing people throw Tarrasques around that were former 2E players that were now playing 3rd edition. and they were like, "Oh yeah, I got to throw this in there. I'm going to really mess people up."
So I am checking right now. I believe it actually was a 1E creature. Let me go back and see.
That is interesting to know.
May have been in. If anybody in the chat knows before I get to this, tell us.
Please.
I'm seeing. I'm seeing it in Monster Manual 2, First Edition, 1983.
Really? Mm-hmm. Well then, and see, yeah, and that may be why I didn't see it, because Monster Manual 2, I may have gotten that toward the end of my time of playing in my teens. I may have mentioned this on the show before, but my gaming ended about the same in my teens, about the same time I started dating.
Yep.
Some of us were a little bit more interested, you know. If I could have dated a girl who played D&D, well, that would have been like amazing for me.
Looks like that's the first appearance. Monster Manual 2. French myth. The troll does point out it is a French mythical creature. It actually does have a connection to folklore, but Monster Manual 2 is first as far as D&D is concerned. Yep.
Yeah, I would consider the Monster Manual 2 first edition, most definitely.
Oh yeah, definitely. Good deal. All right. Well, so let's move on to our last topic for the evening, and that is we're going to continue talking about Gary. And I thought it would be interesting. We've looked at the past, right? We've looked at memories and reminiscing on Gary and who he was as a person, but we are at 47 years of Dungeons and Dragons now, and we've it's been a while since we lost Gary, so I think the question begs to be asked: what of Gary's legacy is still applicable today? Obviously, D&D as a whole, as an entity, is applicable. But what beyond that? What other contributions to the gaming hobby that he had are still applicable today? And the reason why I asked this question is because I saw a thread, a post on a D&D 5th edition group this week, where someone was talking about keeping time in their D&D game. And this was a new DM, to be fair, but he said, how strict are you about keeping time? Because there's a quote by Gary Gygax that says, if you can't keep a good sense of time in your game, then it's going to devolve into chaos or something to that effect. And to which a lot of people said, well, that's bull. Like, keep time however you want to keep it. Don't listen to everything that Gary Gygax ever said. It's all dated and out of touch, and so on and so forth. And I get to an extent what they were saying about that one specific thing, but I didn't quite agree with all of the rest of it. I think there are still some things that are applicable here. So the first thing that I want to talk about, and this was the thing that I talked about on it, was the fact that yes, Gary was a rules designer. He started as a war gamer. He thought very mechanically about things. You can see that in his in his system. It's robust and yet not at the same time. It is overly crunchy in certain spots and not crunchy enough in other spots. and that's why we have had this continuous evolution of D&D. But I have heard many people say that if there wasn't a rule for it, Gary would just make something up. He'd be like,
"Oh, that's definitely true."
He'd be like, "Okay, Gary sure. You want to do that? Absolutely. Okay, yeah. Roll a percentile for this, or and he just makes something up." And I think a lot of like just hearing some of the stories, a lot of the magic spells that we know kind of came about like that, right? I believe, if I recall the story about Melf's acid arrow correctly, Luke wanted to have Melf, Melf gained a couple of wizard levels, training with Mordenkainen, and he wanted a spell because Melf was a ranger, was an archer, he was an elf. He wanted him to have some magic, but he wanted something that looked like an elf magic. So he's like, what if I make a spell that looks like an arrow and it does acid damage? Because he's a kid. And that sounded cool. And from what
sounds cool.
It still sounds cool. I still like using acid arrow, even though it doesn't scale properly. And then the story goes that Gary was like, okay, sure, this is what it does, and just came up with it. That is like, now so many DMs take that for granted because we're 47 years down the road that you make stuff up on the fly, and that was something that he and it's in the books too. It's like your players have,
one of the reasons I think,
have freedom to do what they want to do and just go with it.
Yeah, and one of the reasons I think Gary gets the rap of being a rules lawyer is because it was the beginning of the hobby, and they wanted to do everything they could to hold on to their intellectual property. And we talk about that. We get angry about people trying to hold on to their intellectual property to the degree that TSR did it at the time. But you have to understand, these are people who are getting money for the first time in their life. Yeah. And they are so afraid, I think, this is my opinion, no one else's, that somebody else is going to swoop in and take it. And he was also trying to standardize the rules for tournament play.
Yes, that's what I was going to get to. Yep.
Yeah, they were trying to get to that point where they could have standardized rules for tournament play, so that when you came in, they could give you prizes. You needed those standardized rules. You couldn't use house rules. And so the Mouthpiece magazines were going to promote that, which makes sense. I mean, we've all, those of us who've grown up, we've all played our own forms of street ball, our own forms of basketball, things like that, where we added rules in or we took rules out because that's the way it was. But we knew when we got on the basketball court, we had to play according to those rules. And I think that's what Gary was trying to do. Personally, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, I agree with you on that. I was watching, another one of the things I was doing in preparation for this was I watched some interviews with Tim Kask talking about those early days, and he made a mention about the tournaments and said that they were making a lot of money off tournaments. Like that was like the early days of TSR. Like that was how they were making their money, was still running like D&D tournaments at wargaming conventions. And so you've got to have a standardized rule set for that. I think I agree 100% with that. I think that's there. I think that's in the ether for you to go find that out yourself.
And I think that's part of the tension we get out of that time period is there's a need for standardized rules for tournament play or for professional play. I forget what they call it now, but
rules as written. Like raw?
Yeah, they call it raw, rules as written, but there was a term they used to use back in the RPGA, Role-Playing Game Association. And they needed those standardized rules for play. But at the same time, we know that Gary was a rules tinkerer. That's how Dungeons and Dragons came about. He and Dave Arneson would talk on the phone for hours, long distance, and they would be tinkering with rules.
Yep.
Gary was always tinkering with rules from other systems before he ever published D&D.
Yep.
And that's something all of us do today.
Yeah.
There were many people in that period in history, especially in the 60s and 70s, that didn't think you were supposed to tinker with the rules. You weren't supposed to change up the rules.
Yep.
And so I think that's something that is still long lasting in our hobby. We all want to tinker with the rules. My DM is always tinkering with a few new rules, and he's tweaking them in the way that he wants to. And I think that's important for people to realize is without that rules tinkering, we would not have the games we have today. We wouldn't have the flexibility in games that we have today.
Yeah.
And it's also important to remember that when we are playing with new people, or we're playing at a convention or something like that, or we're playing in tournament play, we need standardized rules. You need both.
Yeah.
You need both.
You do need both. You do need both. But that's and obviously as your DM, I appreciate you bringing that up, that I do tend to tinker with rules a lot. But that's one of the things that I like about being a DM is tinkering with my world. I mean, I've been building on this world for years, and I love to tinker with it. I love to say, ooh, this new thing came out. I wanna put that in there. Or I mean, and it doesn't have to be D&D rules. We'll talk about kit bashing and homebrewing on another show, but let me just tell you folks, you don't have to just use D&D rules in a D&D game. Go grab from other places. It will blow your mind when you're like, oh, this is so much easier if I just grab this rule instead of this rule. It's awesome. Oh, yeah. I love doing that. But yeah, the innovative spirit is definitely in DMing and in role-playing in general, I think is there also. The Troll says, at our table, Gary would repeatedly challenge Gene about the rules, who had helped with 2E, and it was a 2E game. He was joking with her, but we didn't know and thought he was irritating at first. I almost said something, stupid guy in my 20s, but my friend leaned over and saved me. He said, read his badge before you speak up. I didn't know G was sitting next to me until then. I didn't know Gary was sitting with me until then. Man, that's like you see those every once in a while. Like the modern equivalent of that is where like someone starts ranting about something on Twitter, and then like the actual creator of that thing like posts on it and it's like, actually no, by the way, it's like this instead. And they're like, you don't know what you're talking about. Like, I literally wrote it. Yeah, that would be it. That's the early version of that. Dave Carroll says, how much did Gary influence and support the fantasy artists? Oh, specifically the ones that worked in the bullpen. I think it varies. Not to give too much of Derek's upcoming project away, but when he and I went up and talked to Larry Elmore, Larry said that he said like maybe Gary came down to the bullpen like twice. Like by that point, like when we're thinking about like those guys, right? We're talking about Elmore and Easley and Parkinson. Like Gary was already doing the Hollywood stuff. Because we're talking early 80s here, right? So I don't think he was as involved there as much. But, you know, he was the one that in those early days was like, we do need to have some illustrations in there. I mean, he did make the decisions on certain, the way certain things look.
He did. Larry Elmore talks about the Red Box set.
Yep.
And he shared this story many times. He shared it in the documentary, but that's not the only place. For example, Dave Carroll, are you familiar with the red box set that Frank Mincer, what's referred to as the Mincer box set or the Backney box set,
or the red box?
Yeah,
just
or the red
box. Yeah,
the red
definitely.
box.
Dave says definitely.
Okay, well, Larry Elmore talks about that, and I have the picture on my wall. I don't know
if you can get it down or not, but
I'm not pulling it down because then I'd have to figure out how to put it back up.
Yeah.
But I have the original picture here. I'll just do this number.
Here we go.
Can you see it?
Kind of. We can kind of see it.
All right,
it's a little blurry, but
Elmore's. There we go. I messed up. Can you hear me all right?
Yeah, we can still hear you.
Okay, good.
Don't do that again.
I'm not going to do that again. So that picture is the original print, and it's a print of the original picture. And what it shows is that dragon fighting a fighter over a hoard of gold, like you're familiar with. But in that original picture, you also see a female wizard casting a spell at the dragon, and you see a halfling out in the corner. And what Larry Elmore said when he showed this to Gary, he said, "This is a print, original size, of the quick sketch for the cover painting of Basic Dungeons and Dragons. Gary Gygax wanted only the dragon and warrior in the painting, so it would jump out and get you."
Yeah.
So Gary did have input.
Yeah.
In the early days, when they were just looking for any illustration, Tim Kask shares the story of what occurred back then. And when they were just looking for any type of illustration, what Tim Kask says is they would get lots of pictures submitted to them in the mail. They would get sketches and things like that. And they would have the artist's name and information. And when he just needed filler artwork, he would just go grab something out of the file that went along with what it was. So it really depends. Like in the early days, I don't think Gary probably had a lot of input. It was just like, let's get whatever we can get in there, because they didn't have staff artists.
Yeah.
Then when they got staff artists, they're already so big that Gary's only going to have input on big projects.
Yeah.
Whereas the smaller projects like adventure modules and things like that are going to be more influenced by whoever's head of that department.
Yeah, the art director on the project or whatever. Yeah.
Yeah, the art director on the project.
Yeah, yeah.
But
all that being said, it's a good question about Gary's influence as far as like, what should you look at? Because another thing I want to bring up is Appendix N. I think that Appendix N is such a nice little body of work. And if you don't know what Appendix N is, this was an appendix that was in the back of the first edition basic D&D, right? I think it was in.
Well, Appendix N was in the Dungeon Master's Guide.
Yes, that's what I was about to say. It was in the DMG.
Appendix N. Yeah, it was in the first edition DMG.
Yeah.
Though they had something similar to it in the Mulvey.
The Mulvey one, right?
Yeah, in Mulvey they had something similar.
Yeah. And it's basically just a list of all of the fictional things, mostly written fiction, authors, titles, things like that you should go read to get a better sense of what they are thinking when they designed this.
Yes.
And you can see a lot of the names that are associated with Gary's creative juices are in there. People like Vance are in there. Herbert is in there with Dune. So it wasn't just fantasy. There was some sci-fi in there too. I think Asimov was in there, if I recall. But that I think codified really the style of D&D. And anything that was published after that had to fit that feel, had to fit the feel of one of those things. It couldn't be anything that was overly super heroic. It could have obviously fantasy elements, but a lot of it was grounded, and then, that was what they had at the time. Now, that has since been revised and revised and revised, and I think 5th edition actually has an appendix in both, I think, both the player's guide, the player's handbook, and the dungeon master's guide, if I recall. And they're slightly different, but they're expanded because it's about whatever is now there that you should think of. I mean, because we're 47 years down the road again. But the fact that here is Gary Gygax and the others who worked on those early editions saying, it's okay, go borrow. Go find what you like about Once and Future King, or go find what you like about Dune, or go find whatever, and use it. That makes for a richer story when you are dungeon mastering. And Derek knows, because he finds it every once in a while when I bring something up in our games. I copy the heck out of stuff. I switch it up and I use the best parts. But as an artist, I was trained years ago to borrow what you can, synthesize what you can, and then push aside what you don't need. It's the Picasso quote, right? Good artists borrow, great artists steal. Like, that's the truth. Like, you're always influenced, you're always synthesizing and trying to pull something out of thin air. It's just not going to happen. That didn't happen with him. It didn't even happen with Tolkien. If we're going back to his influences, it didn't happen with Tolkien. Tolkien was pulling out of Beowulf and ancient folk myths and things like that. So you're always influenced by something, and go with it.
And that tells you a lot of the history of our hobby. I guess I haven't read the New Player's Handbook so well. I was looking at that and looking at some of the differences between the 5e Player's Handbook and what was in Appendix N in the original DMG, and it looks like they put almost everything that was in the original Appendix N and then expanded
on it. Yep, they did.
They in the new one they've got people like Patrick Rothfuss, who wrote In the Name of the Wind, that King Killer's Chronicle, which he's never going to finish.
Yeah, well, George R.R. Martin is in there also, and who knows if that's ever going to get finished either.
Right.
But they also put in Margaret Weiss and Tracy Hickman and R.A. Salvatore and Ed Greenwood, and I appreciate that.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, because they did model it.
One of the big things that you did mention, and I appreciated you mentioning this, is that Gary Gygax and D&D were influenced by the sword and sorcery genre.
Yeah. And
I think that's important to know, that Gary's legacy is there. We often try and think that Gary's legacy is about high fantasy, like Tolkien and things like that, where you have this epic story. And so many game masters are trying to weave this epic story and this epic world, where when you're looked at, people that influence Gary, he says, are Jack Vance, Fritz Leibert, Robert E. Howard. This is high action, high intensity fantasy.
Yeah.
Now, don't get me wrong. If you want epic fantasy, you want Tolkien-esque fantasy, that's fine. That takes a lot of work to turn that into a campaign. Me, I prefer Leiber. I prefer Vance. I prefer Conan through Robert E. Howard. I want that epic fighting battle type thing, going in and swinging and taking out the bad guys, and that's just very visceral for me. And that is a part of the history of Dungeons and Dragons I think sometimes people forget as they're trying to weave these epic stories and tales. And I see some of these young game masters get hung up on that. They're like, how do I make my tale more epic? And I'm just like, don't worry about it. Just have fun.
Yeah.
Go out, kill some monsters, and take their stuff.
Yep. It will naturally come. So you tell me, Derek, where do I fall on that spectrum? Am I epic fantasy, or am I?
I would say your games tend to be more epic.
Yeah,
I would say that, and that's perfectly fine, and I enjoy playing in your games.
But where we are now is epic. You guys are 15th, 16th level in our current campaign.
Yeah.
Where did we start? You were boots on the ground guys.
Yeah. Well, what I mean by epic fantasy is that you have a world crafted with a lot of rich history that you created yourself.
Sure.
That is your game world.
Right.
Fritz Leiber created a city, Langmore.
Yep.
And that's it.
That's it.
There's no epic world there.
Yeah.
There's
a little bit, like if you read like the early like Fafhrd and Grey Mousers, like you get to see where Fafhrd lived. You get to see the cold north. Like you get a little bit of outside of it, but
it's get snippets.
It's Langmore. I mean, it is.
That's what I love. That is the type of setting I love.
Yeah.
I want a more sandbox setting. And that's one of the things that's nice about worlds like that. You can expand it with your own ideas, your things like that.
But what I was going to say though is that comes down the road. When you are starting out, start small. Start with a group of adventurers on a road. They don't even have to be in a tavern. They can already be on the road going to their first quest. You don't have to know anything about the world around you. You don't have to know anything about the villain at the end of the dungeon or whatever it is. Just start there. And the rest of it will come, because you'll complete that story. And then you'll complete the next story. And then you'll need this city that they've got to go to over there. And you'll need this tower that they've got to go to over there. And suddenly you've got to have a reason for there to be a giant here. So you work that in. And the world builds itself out. That's what happened with my world. I've just been building on it for so long.
And that's perfectly cool.
And when
my thing is I'm too destructive. I like blowing worlds up. So.
You can certainly try.
Yeah, no. I'm
this
talking about it as a DM. As a DM, when I'm DMing, I like to blow worlds up. I don't like to blow the worlds up I'm playing in.
Oh, okay.
I like to.
You do a pretty good job of that too.
Well, yeah. Well, that's only because you let Faye out into the world. And,
I didn't do it. Y'all did.
Yeah. Every DM says that. I didn't do it. The players did it.
So Dave Carroll says Joseph Campbell's hero's journey shows amazing archetypes that you can see in Star Wars and Fellowship of the Ring and Odysseus. Absolutely.
Oh, of course.
I am a huge Joseph Campbell fan. Now, I also like to break Joseph Campbell and like flip those archetypes on their heads sometimes, because I think that makes for interesting things too. But there is a resonance there with some of those archetypes that you just can't get past. And the hero's journey is exactly what I'm talking about. We start off with a little guy on a road. Maybe he's a farm boy who's trying to go see a bigger place than the world he's living on. And then the epic quest ensues from there. But you start small. And that's why I do, like, I've seen this debate as well, especially with 5th edition right now. What level do you start your characters at? Because there are some people that are like, ugh, low levels are such a slog to play through. I don't like to play at low levels. And some people are like, well, low levels are the best part to play through because that's where your character development comes in. I tend to lean towards the later, because I think that at those low levels, you can get a sense of who your character is before they become something great. Like Derek's character, Sean, is our bard, and he started off as just a random, traveling bard that was looking for his next gig, and now he's just like inspired the last paladin in our world to restart the Paladin Order when no one else could. That's epic, but it took 15 levels to get there. Like, it's like it will come on its own, and that's my advice to any of those young dungeon masters are like, it's too much. I can't. No, you just start with what you know, and the rest will come. Dave Carroll says, I played Treasure Hunt, started at 0 level. I think we mentioned, I can't remember if we mentioned this on a previous episode or not. I love playing starting at 0 level. I haven't done it with adults in a while, but when I am teaching kids how to play D&D, I taught my kids this way. They started as 0 level kids. Like I had a 0 level class for them, and as they started to gain some of their experience, they unlocked whatever their first level abilities were going to be. 3rd edition had a 0 level. Well, they didn't have. I don't think it was technically. I think you could do 0 level, but they also had the NPC classes.
Yeah.
And that's a lot of fun to play too. I love doing that.
I did that with my players. What I did when I was running 3rd edition, what I did with my players, and I love this about 3rd edition, is I would let them choose an NPC level.
Yep.
And I gave it to them as a bonus level. Excuse me.
No.
Yeah, sneezing here. But what I did in 3rd edition is I gave all of my players, I let them all choose an NPC level. They got all the skills from it. They were all considered class skills. There was no penalty for it. There was no level penalty.
Yeah.
And they could do that. And so my people that wanted to go straight fighter, every one of them would take warrior.
Sure.
Just to get that hit point bonus.
Yep.
And it gave them a hit point kicker.
Yep.
But what I really loved was like the one character who was like, I'm taking it in blacksmith.
Yeah.
I'm going to be
an expert, right?
Yeah, expert classes.
Yep.
And I let them take those expert classes, and they would weave such great backgrounds. And so what would happen is, eventually, I would let them, depending on how they did it with their blacksmith class, I made it easier for them to get a masterwork item.
Yeah.
Things like that.
Yeah, exactly.
It worked out nice.
And
Wayfork Woodwork says, I mainly play Dungeon Crawl Classics, so starting from nothing is my bread and butter. A little too much for some, though.
Yeah.
Dock worker at Seaport, Dave Carroll says.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
See,
right.
And I like stuff like that.
I do too.
My biggest thing is, here's what I don't like about some systems, and don't take this as any offense against Dungeon Crawl Classics, because I know how that works, and I love Joseph Goodman and Goodman Games. They're good people. But my problem is when when you have to roll up so many 0 level characters and they go through that meat grinder.
Yeah.
I kind of understand that, but I got burnt out on that in Traveler when I would character. I'm seeing this character take shape. I'm getting this background. Oh, he's a former Marine. He did these great things. He did this, and now he's dead.
Yep.
Let me create another freaking character.
Yeah.
I'm just starting to salivate, and they die.
Yeah.
So,
right. Yeah.
So that was one of the reasons I used the expert classes. Not like the safety of the Tomb of
Horrors. And there's another great contribution of Gary's that is long lasting, the Tomb of Horrors, reprinted, I think, in every edition of Dungeons and Dragons. One of the few adventures that has been, and people still
read Tomb of Horrors one time at GaryCon, and it was so freaking funny, because these players never got past the initial hallway.
Oh my gosh.
And they didn't even get to the sphere of annihilation.
Oh, they were just getting stuck in all like the...
They went off on the side.
Yeah.
They all knew how tough the Tube of Horrors could be. And there's like this one little side passage, and they took it, and they woke up these freaking gargoyles and all this other stuff.
Yeah.
They were falling into pit traps left and right. And they in that 4 hours, I have never seen a group of players do so horrible. And I had 8 or 9 people in there. And while and we just ended, time ran out. Time ran out for this 4-hour adventure, and so I didn't get in my TPK, but I did
You
lose
might as
about
well
4 of
have.
them.
I mean,
Yeah, yeah.
So if we were back when if we go back to the days when Tomb of Horrors was a tournament module, they would have not won the tournament.
They would not have. They would not have. It was, well, here's the fun part: is some of them were old school players who had never run through Tomb of Horrors. Some of them were old school players who had gone through it. Though I let them know I'd switched some things up because I didn't trust them.
Yeah, right.
And then some of them were new players, but everybody had heard the legend of the Tomb of Horror.
Right.
And so they were so freaking cautious.
Yeah.
They were so freaking cautious
sure.
that they were taking forever to do anything.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so it was the easiest thing in the world to DM. You know, I'd be like, okay, what do you guys want to do next? And they're arguing for 15 minutes around the table. At GaryCon, they'd have the person coming up with the DMs with the snacks for the game masters. And I'd be like, yeah. And I'm over here eating, and I've eaten, and finally, after I'd finished eating, okay, did you guys decided yet? They're like, no. I said, well, you got 10 seconds.
We poke it with a stick.
Yeah, poke it with a stick.
Yeah.
Leroy Jenkins it, as my wife would say.
That's right.
My wife is a Leroy Jenkins role player.
Yes, she is. Yes, she is.
If you slow down if you start bogging down the game, she will just come in there and start smashing the crap out of stuff.
Yeah.
She's a barbarian.
Yes, she is. She is. She's fun to DM for, though. So I think this will probably be the last thing we wrap on, talking about Tomb of Horrors. Actually, this is a great kind of way to bring this all back around. I guess probably my most like Gary tied memory is that the day that the news broke that Gary had died. I had a D&D game that night. I was running a I think we were weekly. Yeah, we were running a weekly game. Some of the guys that you play with now, Derek, were in this game. And they all got together and I said, "Hey guys, Gary died today." And they were like, "We should do something." And I had Tomb of Horrors. And none of them had ever run through it. None of them really knew anything about it. And we ran Tomb of Horrors. And of course, it took several sessions to complete it. But that ended up becoming the basis for that campaign that we eventually took to 20th level. It was the first time I'd ever gone to 20th level with a campaign. And Acererak was actually the big bad for the entire campaign. And it was it all spawned out of just taking a moment to remember Gary. So I have very fond memories of Tomb of Horrors because of that. So I think it's a good place to wrap it up for tonight. We appreciate everybody who sat with us. Appreciate everybody who sat with us through the Cone of Silence. As always, such great comments coming in through the chat. We love talking with you guys. Yeah. Spread the word. If you've got friends that love talking about this stuff, tell them to come join us. We always will get off on tangents and talk about stuff that you guys want to talk about. We just have our topics to give us something to talk about for an hour or so. So please spread the word for us. Let folks know what we do here. I think that's it.
As they say on YouTube, click, share, like, let everybody know about this program.
Yeah.
We want to interact with you. And if you know younger gamers, let them know. We want their input too.
Just because this is named The Good Grognards does not mean that it's only for old folks. We play with everybody. Everyone is welcome at our table. And absolutely, we want to have those new generations in as well. That was sort of originally one of the reasons why we wanted to do this, was to talk to everybody.
That's it.
That's it. So, Derek, anything else that you'd like to say before we wrap up for the night?
I don't care whether it's the dinner table, whether it's the gaming table, or the Lord's table. Just be kind to one another.
Yep. Yep. And be good to each other. Have a good night, folks. We see y'all next week.
Take it easy. See you next week.
Bye.